Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. We're still with the spirit section. Self-alienated spirit, culture, absolute freedom, and terror. Consciousness has found its notion in utility, but it is partly still an object, and partly, for that very reason, still an end to be attained, which consciousness does not find itself to possess immediately. Utility is still a predicate of the object, not itself a subject or the immediate and sole actuality of the object. It is the same thing that appeared before, when being for self had not yet shown itself to be the substance of the other moments. A demonstration which would have meant that the useful was directly nothing else but the self of consciousness, and that this latter was thereby in possession of it. This withdrawal from the form of objectivity of the useful has, however, already taken place in principle, and from this inner revolution there emerges the actual revolution of the actual world, the new shape of consciousness, absolute freedom. In fact, what we have here is no more than an empty show of objectivity, separating self-consciousness from possession, for partly all existence and validity of the specific members of the organization of the actual world and the world of faith have, in general, returned into this simple determination as into their ground and spiritual principle. Partly, however, this simple determination no longer possesses anything of its own. It is rather pure metaphysic, pure notion, or pure knowing by self-consciousness. That is to say, of the being in and for itself, of the useful qua object. Consciousness recognizes that its being in itself is essentially a being for another. A being in itself, as devoid of self, is in truth a passive self, or that which is a self for another self. The object, however, exists for consciousness in the abstract form of pure being in itself, for consciousness in pure insight is pure insight, whose distinctions are in the pure form of notions. But the being for self into which being for another returns, i.e. the self, is not a self belonging exclusively to what is called object and distinct from them. For consciousness, qua pure insight, is not a single self, which could be confronted by the object as equally having a self of its own, but its pure notion, the gazing of the self into the self, the absolute seeing of itself doubled, the certainty of itself is the universal subject, and its conscious notion is the essence of all actuality. If then the useful was merely the alternation of the moments, an alternation which did not return into its own unity, and hence was still an object for knowing, it now ceases to be this, for knowing is itself the movement of those abstract moments. It is the universal self, the self of itself, as well as of the object, and as universal is the self returning unity of this movement. Spirit thus comes before us as absolute freedom. It is self-consciousness which grasps the fact that its certainty of itself is the essence of all the spiritual masses or spheres, of the real as well as of the supersensible world, or conversely, that essence and actuality, our consciousness, is knowledge of itself. It is conscious of its pure personality and therein of all spiritual reality. And all reality is solely spiritual. The world is for it simply its own will, and this is a general will, and what is more, this will is not the empty thought of will, which consists in a silent assent, or assent by a representative, but a real general will, the will of all individuals as such, for will is in itself the consciousness of personality, or of each, and it is as this a genuine actual will that it might be, that it ought to be, as the self-conscious essence of each and every personality, so that each, undivided from the whole, always does everything, and what appears as done by the whole is the direct and conscious deed of each. This undivided substance of absolute freedom ascends the throne of the world without any power being able to resist it. For since in truth consciousness alone is the element in which the spiritual beings or powers have their substance, the entire system, which is organized and maintained by division into masses or spheres, has collapsed, now that the individual consciousness conceives the object as having no other essence than self-consciousness itself, or as being absolute notion. What made the notion into an existent object was its dimension into separate subsistent spheres, But when the object becomes a notion, there is no longer anything in it with a continuing existence. Negativity has permeated all its moments. It comes into existence in such a way that each individual consciousness raises itself out of its allotted sphere, no longer finds its essence and its work in this particular sphere, but grasps itself as the notion of will, grasps all spheres as the essence of this will, and therefore can only realize itself in a work which is a work of the whole. In this absolute freedom, therefore, all social groups or classes, which are the spiritual spheres into which the whole is articulated, are abolished. The individual consciousness that belonged to any such sphere and willed and fulfilled itself in it has put aside its limitation. Its purpose is the general purpose, its language, universal law, its work, the universal work. Robespierre, Danton and Marat. Marat is the ugly one. Well, actually, that doesn't really narrow it down. The object and the moment of difference have here lost the meaning of utility, which was the predicate of all real being. Consciousness does not begin its movement in the object as if this were something alien from which it first had to return into itself. On the contrary, the object is for consciousness itself. The antithesis consists, therefore, solely in the difference between the individual and the universal consciousness, but the individual consciousness itself is directly in its own eyes that which had only the semblance of its antithesis. It is universal consciousness and will. The beyond of this is that its actual existence hovers over the corpse of the vanished independence of real being, or the being of faith, merely as the exhalation of a stale gas, of the vacuous être supreme. That's French. After the various spiritual spheres and the restricted life of the individual have been done away with, as well as his two worlds, all that remains, therefore, is the imminent movement of universal self-consciousness as the reciprocity of self-consciousness in the form of universality and of personal consciousness. The universal will goes into itself and is a single individual will to which universal law and work stand opposed, but this individual consciousness is no less directly conscious of itself as universal will. It is aware that its object is a law given by that will and a work accomplished by it. Therefore, in passing over into action and in creating objectivity, it is doing nothing individual, but carrying out the laws and functions of the state. This movement is thus the interaction of consciousness with itself, in which it lets nothing break loose to become a free object standing over against it. It follows from this that it cannot achieve anything positive, either universal works of language or of reality, either of laws and general institutions of conscious freedom, or of deeds and works of a freedom that wills them. The work which conscious freedom might accomplish would consist in that freedom qua universal substance, making itself into an object and into an enduring being. This otherness would be the moment of difference in it, whereby it divided itself into stable spiritual masses or spheres, and into the members of various powers. These spheres would be partly the thought things of a power that is separated into legislative, judicial and executive powers, but partly there would be the real essences and found in the real world of culture, and looking more closely at the content of universal action. They would be the particular spheres of labour, which would be further distinguished as more specific estates or classes. A universal freedom, which would have separated itself in this way into its constituent parts, and by the very fact of doing so would have made itself into an existent substance, would thereby be free from a particular individuality and would apportion the plurality of individuals to its various constituent parts. This, however, would restrict the activity and the being of the personality to a branch of the whole, to one kind of activity and being. When placed in the element of being, personality would have the significance of a specific personality. it would cease to be in truth a universal self-consciousness, neither by the mere idea of obedience to self-given laws, which would assign to it only a part of the whole, nor by its being represented in law-making and universal action, does self-consciousness let itself be cheated out of reality, the reality of itself, making the law and accomplishing not a particular work, but the universal work itself, for where the self is merely represented and is present only as an idea, there it is not actual. Where it is represented by proxy, it is not. Just as the individual self-consciousness does not find itself in this universal work of absolute freedom, qua existent substance, so little does it find itself in the deeds, proper and individual actions of the will of this freedom. Before the universal can perform a deed, it must concentrate itself into the one of individuality and put at the head an individual self-consciousness, and for the universal will, that should say, the universal will is only an actual will in its inner self, which is a one, but thereby all other individuals are excluded from the entirety of this deed and have only a limited share in it, so that the deed would not be a deed of the actual universal self-consciousness. Universal freedom, therefore, can produce neither a positive work nor a deed. There is left for it only a negative action. It is merely the fury of destruction. But the supreme reality, and the reality which stands in the greatest antithesis to universal freedom, or rather the sole object that will still exist, the sole object, that should say, or rather the sole object that will still exist for that freedom, is the freedom and individuality of actual self-consciousness itself, for that universality which does not let itself advance to the reality of an organic articulation, and whose aim is to maintain itself in an unbroken continuity, at the same time creates a distinction within itself, because it is movement of all consciousness in general, and moreover by virtue of its own abstraction, it divides itself into extremes equally abstract, into a simple, inflexible, cold universality, and into the discrete, absolute, hard rigidity and self-willed atomism of actual self-consciousness. Now that it has completed the destruction of the actual organization of the world, and exists now just for itself, this is its sole object, an object that no longer has any content, possession, existence, or outer extension, but is merely this knowledge of itself as an absolutely pure and free individual self. All that remains of the object by which it can be laid hold of is solely its abstract existence as such. The relation, then, of these two, since each exists indivisibly and absolutely for itself, and thus cannot dispose of a middle term, which would link them together, is one of wholly unmediated pure negation, a negation, moreover, of the individual as a being existing in the universal. The sole work and deed of universal freedom is therefore death. A death which has no inner significance or filling, for what is negated is the empty point of the absolutely free self. It is thus the coldest and meanest of all deaths, with no more significance than cutting off a head of a cabbage or swallowing a mouthful of water. In this flat, commonplace monosyllable is contained the wisdom of the government, the abstract intelligence of the universal will in the fulfilling of itself. The government is itself nothing else but the self-established focus, or the individuality of the universal will. The government which wills and executes its will from a single point, at the same time wins and executes, at the same time wills and executes a specific order and action. On the one hand, it excludes all other individuals from its act, and on the other hand, it thereby constitutes itself a government that is a specific will, and so stands opposed to the universal will. Consequently, it is absolutely impossible for it to exhibit itself as anything else but a faction. Anything else but a faction. What is called government is merely the victorious faction, and in the very fact of its being a faction lies a direct necessity of its overthrow, and its being government makes it conversely into a faction, and so guilty. When the universal will maintains that what the government has actually done is a crime committed against it, the government for its part has nothing specific and outwardly apparent by which the guilt of the will opposed to it could be demonstrated, For what stands opposed to it as the actual universal will is only an unreal pure will, intention being suspected, therefore takes the place or has the significance and effect of being guilty. And the external reaction against this reality, that lies in the simple inwardness of intention, consists in the cold matter-of-fact annihilation of this existent self, from which nothing else can be taken away but its mere being. Marat, chilling out there, probably thinking in his mind about more acts of terror he can be responsible for. However, it has a happy ending. Not for him, though. In this, its characteristic work, absolute freedom becomes explicitly objective to itself, and self-consciousness learns what absolute freedom in effect is. In itself, it is just this abstract self-consciousness which effaces all distinction and all continuance of distinction within it. It is as such that it is objective to itself. The terror of death is the vision of this negative nature of itself, but absolutely free self-consciousness finds this its reality quite different from what its own notion of itself was, namely, that the universal will is merely the positive essence of personality, and that this latter knows itself in it only positively, or as preserved therein. Here, however, this self-consciousness, which as pure insight, completely separates its positive and its negative nature, completely separates the predicateless absolute as pure thought and as pure matter, is confronted with the absolute transition of the one into the other as a present reality. The universal will, qua absolutely positive, actual self-consciousness, because it is this self-conscious reality heightened to the level of pure thought or of abstract matter, changes round into its negative nature and shows itself to be equally that which puts an end to the thinking of oneself or to self-consciousness. Absolute freedom as pure self-identity of the universal will thus has within a negation, but this means that it contains a difference in general, and this again it develops as an actual difference. For pure negativity has in the self-identical universal will the element of subsistence, or the substance in which its moments are realized. It has the matter which it can utilize in accordance with its own determinateness, and insofar as this substance has shown itself to be the negative element for the individual consciousness, the organization of spiritual masses or spheres to which the plurality of individual consciousnesses are assigned thus takes shape once more. These individuals who have felt the fear of death or their absolute master, again submit to negation and distinction, arrange themselves in the various spheres and return to the apportioned and limited task, but thereby to their substantial reality. Out of this tumult, spirit would be thrown back to its starting point, to the ethical and real world of culture, which would have been merely refreshed and rejuvenated by the fear of the Lord and Master, which has again entered men's hearts. Spirit would have to traverse anew and continually repeat this cycle of necessity if the result were only the complete interpenetration of self-consciousness and substance, an interpenetration in which self-consciousness, which has experienced the negative power of its universal essence acting on it, would desire to know and find itself not as the particular individual, but only as universal, and therefore too would be able to endure the objective reality of universal spirit, a reality excluding self-consciousness qua particular. But in absolute freedom there was no reciprocal action between a consciousness that is immersed in the complexities of existence, or that sets itself specific aims and thoughts, and a valid external world, whether of reality or thought. Instead, the world was absolutely in the form of consciousness as a universal will, and equally self-consciousness was drawn together out of the whole expanse of existence, or manifested aims and judgments, and concentrated into the simple self. The culture to which it attains in interaction with that essence is therefore the grandest and the last, is that of seeing its pure simple reality immediately vanish and pass away into empty nothingness. In the world of culture itself, it does not get as far as to behold its negation or alienation in this form of pure abstraction. On the contrary, its negation is filled with the content, either honour or wealth, which it gains in place of the self that it has alienated from itself, or the language of spirit and insight which has disrupted consciousness acquires, or it is the heaven of faith, or the utility of the Enlightenment. All these determinations have vanished in the loss suffered by the self in absolute freedom. Its negation is the death that is without meaning, the sheer terror of the negative that contains nothing positive, nothing that fills it with a content. At the same time, however, this negation in its real existence is not something alien. It is neither the universal, inaccessible necessity in which the ethical world perishes, nor the particular accident of private possession, nor the whim of the owner on which the disrupted consciousness sees itself dependent. On the contrary, it is the universal will which in its ultimate abstraction has nothing positive and therefore can give nothing in return for the sacrifice. But for that very reason it is immediately one with self-consciousness, or it is the pure passivity, because it is the pure negative and the meaningless death. The unfilled negativity of the self changes round in its inner notion into absolute positivity. For consciousness, the immediate unity of itself with the universal will, its demand to know itself as this specific point in the universal will, is changed round into the absolutely opposite experience. What vanishes for it in that experience is abstract being, or the immediacy of that insubstantial point, and this vanished immediacy is the universal will itself, which it now knows itself to be so far as it is pure knowing or pure will. Consequently, it knows that will to be itself, and knows itself to be the essential being, but not essential being as an immediate existence, not will as revolutionary governance or anarchy, striving to establish anarchy, nor itself as the centre of this faction or the opposite faction. On the contrary, the universal will is its pure knowing and willing, and it is the universal will qua this pure knowing and willing. It does not lose itself in that will, for pure knowing and willing is much more it than is that atomic point of consciousness. It is thus the interaction of pure knowing with itself. Pure knowing qua essential being is the universal will, but this essential being is absolutely nothing else but pure knowing. Self-consciousness is therefore the pure knowing of essential being qua pure knowing. Further, as the individual self, it is only the form of the subject of a real action, a form which is known by it as form. Similarly, objective reality, being, is for it simply a selfless form, for that reality would be something that is not known. This knowing, however, knows knowing to be essential being. Absolute freedom has thus removed the antithesis between the universal and the individual will. The self-alienated spirit, driven to the extreme of its antithesis, in which pure willing and the agent of that pure willing are still distinct, reduces the antithesis to a transparent form and therein finds itself. Just as the realm of the real world passes over into the realm of faith and insight, so does absolute freedom leave itself destroying reality and pass over into another land of self-conscious spirit, where in this unreal world freedom has the value of truth. In the thought of this truth, spirit refreshes itself insofar as it is and remains thought, and knows this being which it encloses within self-consciousness to be essential being in its perfection and completeness. There has arisen the new shape of spirit, that of the moral spirit. Charlotte Corday, my type of woman. Although I wouldn't want her coming scrubbing my back when I was in the bath, I suppose. Anyway, she was executed for this, went to the guillotine a few days after. Very sad business, very sad. Anyway, on to the subject of morality next. Not my particular area of expertise, but I'll run through it.